We'll turn now then to the piece we have in The Right Thing to Do on the other side of the animals debate. Tibor Machen's piece entitled Do Animals Have Rights?, where he argues, as you've seen, that they do not. Let me first lead you through some of the central points of what he says, and then we'll consider a number of problems. So, properly, very close to the start of the piece, Machen recognizes that there have been two theoretically quite distinct traditions in the recent pro-animal movement in philosophy. Right? On the one side, you have Singer, as we've seen, arguing for a pro-animal position within a broadly utilitarian framework. By contrast, the second most famous philosopher who writes about this stuff is Tom Regan, and Regan has argued for a pro-animal position in an explicitly deontological or rights-based way. I mean, his big book on this is called, as Machen notes, The Case for Animal Rights. So Machen, very close to the beginning, recognizes this important distinction. Yeah? We see this at the top of page 139. He says, in recent years, the doctrine of animal rights has found champions in important circles where the general doctrine of rights is itself well respected. For example, Professor Tom Regan, in his important book, The Case for Animal Rights, finds the idea of natural rights intellectually congenial, but then extends this idea to cover animals near humans on the evolutionary scale. The tradition within which Regan works is clearly Lockean, only he does not agree that human nature is distinctive enough in relevant respects to restrict the scope of natural rights to human beings alone. Following a different tradition, namely utilitarianism, the idea of animal liberation has emerged. And this idea comes to roughly the same thing, practically speaking. Only the argument is different, because for utilitarians, what is important is not that someone or something must have a specific sphere of dominion, but that they be well off in their lives. So long as the bulk of the relevant creatures enjoy a reasonably high living standard, the moral and political objectives for us will have been met. But if this goal is neglected, moral and political steps are required to improve on the situation. Animal liberation is such a step. So properly at the beginning then, Machen recognizes that there is two distinct traditions. I'll argue, as you'll see in a while, that he doesn't properly follow through on that, but he does notice it when he starts. Right? Then in the very next paragraph you get what amounts to a kind of thesis statement. Right? He says, this essay will maintain that animals have no rights and need no liberation. I will argue to think that they do is a category mistake. It is, to be blunt, to unjustifiably anthropomorphize animals, to treat them as if they were what they are not, namely human beings. Rights and liberty are political concepts, applicable to human beings because human beings are moral agents, in need of what Harvard philosopher Robert Nozick calls moral space. That is, a definite sphere of moral jurisdiction, where their authority to act is respected and protected, so it is they, not intruders, who govern themselves and either succeed or fail in their moral tasks. So that's, I take it, a statement basically of the central thesis. What else should we pick out by way of argument, I guess, or support for this thesis? One claim we should notice Machen making is this claim that there are degrees of value in nature, and that we are more valuable than animals. See him making this claim. 143, start with the final sentence of the middle paragraph. He says, I argue that there is a scale of importance in nature, and among all the various kinds of being, human beings are the most important. Even while it is true that some members of the human species may indeed prove themselves to be the most vile and worthless as well. How do we establish that we are more important or valuable? By considering whether the idea of lesser or greater importance or value in the nature of things makes clear sense, and applying it to an understanding of whether human beings or other animals are more important. If it turns out that ranking things in nature as more important or less important makes sense, and if we qualify as more important than other animals, there is at least the beginning of a reason why we may make use of other animals for our purposes. Next, it's worth seeing the way in which Machen spells out somewhat more fully what he takes to be sort of the source of the reason for attributing human rights. Place to look here is the first paragraph under the heading, Why Individual Human Rights, on 145. There Machen writes, where do individual human rights come into this picture? The rights being talked of in connection with human beings have as their source, as we've noted earlier, the human capacity to make moral choices. We have the right to life, liberty and property, as well as more specialized rights connected with politics, the press, religion, because we have as our central task in life to act morally. And in order to be able to do this throughout the scope of our lives, we require a reasonably clear sphere of personal jurisdiction, a dominion where we are sovereign and can either succeed or fail to live well, to do right, to act properly. Finally, Machen is explicit that if that's the ground basis justification for human rights, that there is no justification for attributing rights to animals. You see this under the heading, Where is there room for animal rights, on 146. He says, we've seen that the most sensible and influential doctrine of human rights rests on the fact that human beings are indeed members of a discernibly different species, the members of which have a moral life to aspire to, and must have principles upheld for them in communities that make their aspiration possible. Now, there is plainly no valid intellectual place for rights in the non-human world, the world in which moral responsibility is, for all practical purposes, absent. Okay, so that's, as I interpret it, Machen's view. Got to be honest, I'm not very impressed with it. Right? I think there's a bunch wrong with it, and I'll focus on making 3 criticisms. I've got a PowerPoint here, so let me preview them for you, and then we'll talk through them in more detail. All got that down? All right. So let's take those objections in turn then. First up, the objection that what Machen says doesn't really doesn't really criticize the utilitarian pro-animal position. It's funny, right? Because, I mean, as I pointed out at the beginning of the article, he sort of recognizes that there are these different traditions. There's the utilitarian tradition and the rights-based tradition, and they're different. And he claims, oh, I'm going to argue against both of them, right? But if you look at what he says, it's basically entirely devoted to making the case that animals don't have rights. But, of course, utilitarians don't think they have rights, right? Utilitarians, properly speaking, don't use the language of rights at all. So showing that that animals don't have rights, if he succeeds in doing that, doesn't refute Singer's sort of position at all. There's a passage actually from the Singer piece that's quite germane here, right? So this is just after the last bit of Singer we read, right? Starting on 127, first full paragraph on 127. Singer says, although Bentham speaks of rights in the passage I've quoted, the argument is really about equality rather than about rights. Indeed, in a different passage, Bentham famously described natural rights as, quote, nonsense, and natural and imprescriptible rights as, quote, nonsense upon stilts. He talked of moral rights as a shorthand way of referring to protections that people and animals morally ought to have. But the real weight of the moral argument does not rest on the assertion of the existence of the right, for this in turn has to be justified on the basis of the possibilities for suffering and happiness. In this way, we can argue for equality for animals without getting embroiled in philosophical controversies about the ultimate nature of rights. In misguided attempts to refute the arguments of this book, some philosophers have gone to much trouble developing arguments to show that animals do not have rights. They've claimed that to have rights, a being must be autonomous, or must be a member of a community, or must have the ability to respect the rights of others, or must possess a sense of justice. These claims are irrelevant to the case for animal liberation. The language of rights is a convenient political shorthand. It is even more valuable in the era of a 30-second TV news clip than it was in Bentham's day. But in the argument for a radical change in our attitude to animals, it is in no way necessary. So Singer's just very clear there, right, that qua utilitarian, he's not basically and fundamentally in the business of talking about rights at all, right? So supposed criticism of his view that involves only making the case that animals don't have rights really completely misses his argument. All right? Yeah, you have a question?
Is it possible that Machen isn't trying to argue against a utilitarian point, but more from a social contract point of view, with the premise of his with the argument that animals are not moral creatures, kind of?
I mean, some of it has a contractualist feel. It does, although I mean, in a way that we'll come to in a bit, that doesn't seem to be really his preferred way of putting it. But look. I mean, the same point holds, though. I mean, if that's what he's doing, it doesn't touch the utilitarian argument, which is not a social contract argument. And, of course, notice that the fact that the social contract theory gives no moral weight to the interests of animals is a thought that we encountered before in the guise of an objection to social contract theory, sort of not an advantage of it, right? So if you're comfortable on that first objection, turn to the second one. The second one, so this thing, I mean, I've just given you the label, the problem of marginal cases. What's that? Well, it is standard terminology for a problem that those that Singer and others would label speciesists face, right? The problem is, if you're going to say you know, if you're going to try and say, you know, animals don't count, human beings do count. And if you're not going to justify that just on the basis of an appeal to biology, then you're going to have to find some other basis for it, right? And the problem is, it looks like any basis you pick is either going to exclude some humans or include some animals. I mean, in effect, the thoughts there in that footnote from Bentham that Singer quotes, right? I mean, if you do it on the basis of rationality, right, then there are clearly a bunch of animals that are more rational than, you know, infants of a day or a week or a month old, right? And the point is basically sort of any of those characteristics that you pick, right, set, you know, the requirements for, you know, counting morally at a certain level. You'll either make the requirements, you know, high enough that the only things that count are human beings, but not all of them do, or you'll set them low enough so as to count all human beings, but you'll get lots of animals in as well. Now, Machen does obliquely address this objection, but to my mind he addresses it in a way that's totally inadequate. Right? Let me point you first to what he says. This is oh yes, it's 147. Starting about, it's that first paragraph on 147, starting about like 10 lines down. He says, "The fact of occasional borderline cases is simply irrelevant. What is crucial is that the generalization is true, that human beings are basically different from other animals by virtue of a crucial threshold in a continuum of degrees." What that seems to suggest is Adler's position is, right, all humans count because the typical human is, you know, more developed than the typical non-human animal, and no non-human animals count because the typical non-human animal is less developed than the typical human. That is, as again, actually other work of Singer's suggests. I mean, that's problematic, right? I mean, what's problematic about it is it involves allotting moral status to beings on the basis of something other than their own individual attributes, right? It involves allotting moral status to them instead on the basis of the species that they're a member of, right? I mean, to see why that might be troubling, you just have to start doing some hypothetical examples, right? So imagine Charlie the super intelligent chimp, right? Now, I mean, some actual chimps have been taught language to some limited extent, right? I mean, there's a bunch of controversy about just what this involves and, you know, different numbers of signs and whatnot they've learned, but they've learned some, right? But, you know, Charlie the super intelligent chimp is different from them, right? I mean, Charlie the super intelligent chimp, we're going to imagine, is, you know, sitting here, he's sitting on that desk over there, right? And he's participating in the conversation. I mean, obviously he's kind of interested in this issue, and he's giving all these criticisms of Machen, and he's doing a very good job. You know, he's coming up with all this nifty stuff, right, about what's wrong with Machen's view. According to Machen, that doesn't mean Charlie counts, right? Because after all, you know, Charlie belongs to a species, typical members of which are less, you know, less developed than we are, right? I mean, you see how that seems like totally unfair to Charlie, right? It seems that we should judge Charlie's moral status on the basis of his attributes, not on the basis of the attributes of the species to which he's a member, right? So, in that way, Machen's response to the problem of marginal cases seems completely inadequate. All right, final objection then. Turn to Macken's sort of account of where rights come from, right? In a couple of places, I quoted one on the PowerPoint. We didn't go back to it, but we saw a couple going through. He's got this kind of teleological story, right, about the source of rights, right? Well, so it's on 145. The bit I quoted, right, is the claim that we have as our central task in life to act morally. Right? So he's got this. I mean, what for him sort of undergirds, justifies his claims about human rights is this claim that we have as our central task in life to act morally. And that sounds like one of these funky teleological Aristotelian things, right? And in this essay, so far as I can see, it doesn't give you any story about where it comes from, right? And yet, right, I mean, he's going to, justify his own view about the nature of rights and dismiss the other side's view on the nature of rights, apparently ultimately on the basis of this funky teleological thing, right? So I want to say about that the stories of the origin of rights go, that's a pretty problematic one. I mean, it rests on this teleological claim that is controversial and, at least in this place, quite undefended, right? I mean, well, I think that. I mean, it looks as though for him it's like this sort of basic starting moral principle we all agree to, that we as human beings have as our fundamental task in life to act morally. Where do we learn that from? So anyway, don't think much of that bit either. So I've got to say, basically, I don't really think much of the Macken piece at all. I think it's all wrong. Anyway. It's not, incidentally, that I think that you could not do a decent job of arguing on the anti-animal side, right? I just happen to think that in this case, the piece that we have in our anthology does not do a good job of it. All right, so I guess we're done with that.